Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Riches. In March 2005, the Council House residents of North East Lincolnshire voted to transfer the management of their homes to Shoreline Housing Partnership, a non-profit making organisation separate from the council and designed to provide affordable accommodation. Shoreline has around 7,900 homes in North East Lincolnshire, housing maybe 25 or 30,000 people. Since the start, its chief executive has been Tony Bramley. Tony, many thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Shoreline does provide affordable housing in Grimsby. Is there a homelessness problem in Grimsby? Do we need affordable housing?
I think the whole country needs affordable housing, and Grimsby in North East Lincolnshire is no different from anywhere else. And yes, there are homeless people. People's circumstances vary dramatically, and we see homeless referrals coming to us from North East Links Council every week, I'm afraid.
And what sort of people do you house? You provide this affordable housing, and yet in recent years it's not been that much cheaper than the private sector rented sector.
Well, certainly it has been the case over the last couple of years in particular. We've seen a closing together of the rents in what we call the social sector, which is our sector, and the private rented sector. And that's something which is quite unusual and almost unique to North East Lincolnshire in its scale. That said, there's always a market for good quality, well-managed, well-maintained rented housing, in our case in the social rented sector, and that's what we think is our strength.
And what's the change? What's the difference that North East Lincolnshire has particularly and recently that's brought the private sector and the social sector so close together?
I think it's been driven partly by the national economic factors, in that the rent profiles in North East Lincolnshire have always been comparatively low, so you haven't seen very high private sector rents in the more compressed urban areas of, say, East and West Marsh. And at the same time, the social rents, which are driven not by market forces but driven by a government national formula, have been pushing up towards some of those rents in some of the lower cost areas. So instead of there being two markets for lower income households, in some senses there's almost becoming one market.
No, Shoreline's a not-for-profit organisation.
That's right.
And if those rents are set by a central formula, there's a risk, of course, that you might not be making as much money as you're expending, which is extremely difficult, but there's also a risk that you might make a profit.
Well, we need to make a surplus. Although we're a charity, we have to make a surplus on our operating activities because we're basically backed by bank loans. That's what's enabled us to purchase the stock and do all the improvements that we've done, and we've spent tens of millions of pounds. In fact, we announced only a few weeks back another £40 million of investment in improvement in the stock. So we need to be making a surplus to enable us to do that. But being a charity, that surplus only stays inside the organisation and can only be used for the benefit of the beneficiaries, which is effectively our customers.
But it's a happy thing for the residents of North East Lincolnshire who rent, that they've got a very open market between the two, between the social and the private.
Yeah, I can see it from their point of view. And we can see the evidence of that, because what we've seen in the past was that when tenants were referred to us, nominated to us or simply joined us, they were often with us for very long periods of time. We've increasingly seen the average length of our tenancies for our newer joiners going down in terms of the amount of time, and their departures increasingly into the private rented sector, which is something we weren't seeing 3 years ago. So you're absolutely right. Those markets are now blending together, and there's not that clear demarcation that there was 3 or 4 years ago.
It tends to be an affordable housing organisation. It's a fairly low rent housing organisation, which means that many of your tenants will be beneficiaries of housing benefit.
Correct, yeah.
Now, the new rules that the government is proposing of housing benefit is that if you've got a spare room that doesn't have somebody sleeping in it, there's a deduction in that benefit, which has been dubbed, rightly or wrongly, the bedroom tax.
Yeah, yeah.
That affects you in ways that doesn't affect private landlords.
That's right. I mean, it only affects the social rented sector, and it's had a pretty dramatic effect on us, to be frank. I mean, by definition, we're not surprised that we've got a lot of low-income households who we assist, because that's what we're here to do. So about 75% of all of our tenants are in receipt of housing benefit, but we have to be clear, a lot of those people are in low-paid work. The common misconception is that they don't work at all, but in fact, a lot of them actually are at work, but they're on low incomes, which is why they get benefits. The bedroom tax has had a big impact on us. Around about 1,300 households that we house have been affected by this change in the welfare reform. Of those 1,300, around about 300 since it was introduced in April last year have already moved out. Either we've helped them to move, we've rehoused them, or they've gone elsewhere. That leaves us with about 1,000, some of whom I'm sorry to say are not coping financially with the change and are running up rent arrears with us.
But if those people who are moving out of Shoreline housing because of the bedroom tax, they're presumably moving to private sector rented accommodation.
In some instances, they are going to private rented, and what's called the local housing allowance, which is the equivalent of housing benefit, is picking up the tab. So there's still a cost to the Exchequer. In other cases, they're moving back in with family that they may have moved out from. They're moving in with friends. In some cases, you know, they may indeed have become homeless as a result. So there's a mixture of departure routes, if you like, for people. So it's not a straightforward story for everybody.
If that's creating a problem of homelessness, is there not some accommodation for them available in the empty bedrooms of other shoreline housing tenants?
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, what the government hoped by introducing this policy was to rebalance the use of the market, so that, in other words, you didn't have what they would consider to be social homes with spare rooms in. So their view would be that you would better utilisation of the smaller homes that you have. But of course the question is, do you have enough smaller homes? Because we've all been pressed as social landlords over the last 30 years to stop building one-bedroom places and to build family-sized homes. So in some cases we've been caught by that. The other thing is that an encouragement to take in lodgers. Well, that's easier said than done depending on your personal circumstances. So as with all these national policy changes, it sounds fine on paper and looks good as a policy change, but when you bring it down to the local level and then bring it down to the individual, there's lots of problems when you try and implement it.
Well, that's the problem of having all law is a universal law that's before which we're all equal, and then we're all in different individual circumstances.
Yeah.
Is there not a way of people like you, but also local government, of making policy in detail in a way that ensures that nobody finds themselves going out on the street?
Well, I
because they've
mean,
got a spare room?
effectively, we're an instrument of government. We are effectively implementing government policy as our North East Links Council, because they're administering the housing benefit change. We try and administer it in as humane and fair way as we can, but there are limitations in what we can do. Our most basic limitation is if people are in a 3-bedroom house and they want a 1-bedroom, or they're in a 2-bedroom and they want a 1-bedroom, have we got 1-bedroom places for them to move to? The answer is we don't have a sufficient supply of 1-bedrooms, so we cannot meet that need. I mean, again, in the local authority, they have provided discretionary housing benefit payments to these households to help them with the transition, but that's not a long-term answer, it's just a short-term answer.
Well, we will move on to housing supply and those issues, but just one other recent government changes in the budget a few weeks ago. The Chancellor of the Exchequer allowed people with pensions to cash in those pensions immediately without having to buy an annuity and without having to just take a pension income, so that they could have that chunk of capital, which many speculate will be used to buy-to-let. And that's likely to expand the private sector, isn't it?
It is, if buy-to-let is a viable proposition in somewhere like North East Lincolnshire. I don't know quite whether really this is the sort of market where you'll see a lot of buy-to-let. I think there will be more buy-to-let because I think people will look at that as a potential investment source for something where they would have been having to use their pension in a different way. Of particular interest to us, in actual fact, is the fact that pension funds are being freed up to invest in property in a way that they perhaps haven't in the past. So you could see pension funds investing with housing associations like ourselves.
So the pension funds rather than the individual pensioners.
Making long-term investments with us as like an institutional investor, with us as an organisation, giving them long-term 30-year horizons of security on their income because of the nature of the businesses that we are. So there are some opportunities that line up there, but we always come back to, will it work in the North East Lincolnshire market? Will it work in this part of the country where the values are comparatively low and the rates of return are comparatively low?
Well, that comes back to maybe the biggest issue of all, which is why is it in North East Lincolnshire that those people who rent privately or socially do pay comparatively small rents? It's a matter of supply and demand. Why do so few people want to live in North East Lincolnshire?
Well, ultimately, everything comes back to the economy. You live in areas which are attractive perhaps to people coming in to retire to, if you're in that sort of part of the countryside where it is literally rural area or perhaps seaside. But in places like this where you've got that mixture, you have an element of that, but really at the heart of it, it's quite an industrial place with the South Bank industries, with the fishing, with the food processing, and now of course with renewables. So the key thing for us in terms of where rents go, it's where the economy goes. If the economy thrives, then rents tend to rise. Economy falters, then rents tend to fall. Now, we're not after driving rents up to make them unaffordable, but at its heart, the housing market follows the broader economy.
So there's a paradox here that the higher the rents in the housing market, the more successful the economy, and the lower, the worse the economy.
Yeah, effectively, and that's why we find ourselves in this slightly unusual situation as a social landlord where we should be at the bottom of the renting pile. In fact, we're finding ourselves part way up that pile.
Well, and at that point, we'll have to stop to take a short break. Please join us again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Hot Topic and to Tony Bramley of Shoreline Housing Partnership. Tony, just before the break we were talking about the housing supply. Clearly there's more demand than there is supply of housing, and that's why people find it difficult to afford sometimes. Why can't we just build more houses?
Well, it's about the economy again. In an area like this where the values are comparatively low and the economy is still fairly fragile, you've got to have investors and developers who have the confidence to go out and buy sites, to put the money into the ground in terms of fees, professional advice, planning, and then build. And if they're going to do that speculatively and they can't be certain about sales, then they won't take that risk. There are easier ways to earn money than doing it that way. And that's why I think you find in a place like North East Lincolnshire, particularly in the urban areas, parts of Grimsby, for example, and some parts of Cleethorpes, that you've got sites which have stood empty for quite long periods of time with no development activity on them.
Well, why is it? I mean, there are brownfield sites in North East Lincolnshire, in Grimsby and Cleethorpes, Immingham, that we're all anybody who goes around this area is very familiar with. There's urban sites. They should be valuable, should they not?
Well, they are valuable in a sense because of their location by definition, because they're very accessible for people and they're very accessible to shops and businesses. Brownfield sites tend to come with additional development costs though, because they're sometimes quite physically constrained, so there can sometimes be access issues. Sometimes, particularly in an area which is quite industrialised, you have quite a lot going on in the ground, literally, which you've got to deal with before you can put houses on top of it. So compared to plonking a house on a field, it's a more expensive proposition. So you've got to be very, very sure that the costs stack up. You've got to then be sure that there's really a market for people who want to live in the centre of the town. And you've heard of so many cases right across the country with cities with people fleeing town centres and living on the edge, and that's the thing that I think the council's a really tough job about, balancing that desire to live on the fringes in the suburbs and in the villages and the need to keep a town centre vibrant. It's a tough thing to get that balance right.
Well, we'll come back to the attractiveness of town centres and brownfield sites, but if people are unwilling to speculate greenfield building in North East Lincolnshire, just a little way south of here, in Louth, people are objecting to greenfield building. There are plans to build 240 homes in St Mary's Park West, 970 homes Legbourne Road, and 149 homes in Fulmer Drive. That's almost 1,359 new homes speculated to be built. Why are people so much more willing to invest in that speculation in Louth than they are in North East Lincolnshire?
Well, because I'm assuming that the investors and developers concerned have a high degree of confidence that Louth and its immediate surroundings are an attractive place for people to live. Now, whether there's the economy there to support it is another matter, but in that case, it could be people retiring into the area, second homeowners, or people who are prepared to commute from Louth to a more industrialised or urban area to actually work. So it's a destination in its own right, and that's the issue for North East Lincolnshire. Is it a housing destination as well as a work destination? That's the thing that's got to be got right.
But what's Louth got that we haven't? I mean, maybe a little bit prettier than Grimsby. A great deal prettier. It's very Jane Austen town. But if that number of people move there, that generates its own economy. If there are people working away, they're earning money elsewhere and spending it in Louth. If they're pensioners, they've earned it elsewhere and they're spending it in Louth.
Absolutely.
It generates its own economy.
It does.
So that self-fulfilling prophecy, that virtuous circle, could that not be pump-primed by some sort of investment just a little further north?
Well, I agree entirely, and that's the $64,000 question. So, for example, if the renewables industry takes off more than it has already and does generate many more hundreds of jobs, the really big question for me, and I think the big question for the council, is how many of those jobs turn into workers who live in North East Lincolnshire, or how many choose to commute in. Therefore, there's a real onus on developers, partners, ourselves and the council and so forth to try and make North East Lincolnshire as a whole a more attractive place for people to live and to work in, so that we don't create the economic benefit of the job and find that the spending power is down in East or West Lindsey.
Just to go back to those brownfield sites, a lot of people who travel through Grimsby, a lot of people who live here, look at the docks. And they look at what's been done with the docks in Liverpool. They look at what's been done with the docks in London, around the Isle of Dogs and St Catherine's docks, and various other parts of the country, in Cardiff Bay. And they think these are the most attractive places. People like to live near water. And these beautiful old buildings are available for conversion. If not the buildings, then there's very safe flat land there that might be exploited. Grimsby docks seem desolate.
Well, I think there's a few factors here which make Grimsby different from those other parts of the country that you've mentioned. The first is obviously that the bulk of that land is in private ownership of ABP, and they have their own particular business interest and business model as to how they'd best like to use that land. I think that's the first factor, and that makes it difficult for the public authorities, I think, to influence some of the development decisions that are taken. The second issue is that why do people live near water? Well, they'll live there because it's close to where they work, or they'll live there because it's a destination in its own right. It's a nice place to live. Now, if North East Lincolnshire can generate the jobs which are water-based, which it seems to be doing, then that creates a rationale for a developer going, well, hold on, why wouldn't I come there? And that's a small step on if you start to generate that mass of them people saying, well, I'll live there anyways, it's a nice place to live. I think the demonstration of that is probably the talk which I've been aware of for the last few years since I've been here about the need for more decent quality hotel bedroom spaces. The fact that, as I understand it, two national chains are investing in North East Lincolnshire and actually building hotels. Now, I think that's symptomatic of a slight change in how the outside world is perhaps viewing North East Lincolnshire as a place to make sensible investments.
Now you're sounding like a man who's winning a game of Monopoly here. We're moving from housing to hotels.
Yes.
Just go through that in a little bit more detail, please. How does is the hotel a symptom, the building of hotels a symptom of an improving economy, or can the building of hotels be the cause of an improving economy?
I think it's both, but I think it's cause and effect. The issue always is what comes first. Well, what comes first is confidence, and confidence comes off the back of signs that the economy is starting to move. And with that, you will get the service industry, such as hotels, arrive. You'll get the national house builders, who are quite absent in this area, suddenly saying, well, hold on a second, what's North East Lincolnshire got to offer? So I take it as a small sign, but a significant sign. If you see those sorts of developments coming in from national chains to say this is a sensible place to invest, I think that is a sign that things are looking up in that sense. It's a question of can you sustain that momentum, and it remains the case. It's fine if those people stay in a hotel, but if they don't then buy a house and live here, they buy a house somewhere else and commute in, then we've lost them. So the key thing again is it's not just the crowd attracting the job, it's about attracting the household to the area.
Well, that is the paradox, isn't it? Because it's wonderful to have the renewable energy sector here, as well as the food sector and all the other aspects of the economy that are thriving all along the south bank of the Humber. But no good to the towns here if people are commuting in from the rural fields of Lincolnshire.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grimsby, whatever the investment that could be made on the docks or in any of the other brownfield sites, it's not ever going to look like Paris or Florence. But what can be done to make it more attractive, not as a place to make money, as an economic generator, but as a place that you do want to live, where you want to put your roses around your front door?
Well, I think it's about having a suitable mix of property types for a start. You know, there's a place for the bungalow, there's a place for the executive home, and there's a place for the start home. And it's about having a policy which encourages developers and organisations like ourselves to provide that sort of range, because what you want is you want that diversity of choice. The other thing I have to say is that what you need to do is you need to create those urban centres, whether it's town centres or suburban centres, which are attractive places to visit in the evening, where people want to go, they want to stay, because otherwise you face the same problem. If it's a place to work, is it a place to live?
We need an opera house.
Well, I don't know about an opera house, I couldn't comment on that, but you need some sort of cultural offer, which sounds very grand, but you need something which keeps people in town, as simple as restaurants, places where people will go and feel comfortable, because again, you're not going to regenerate brownfield sites with people unless they've got somewhere to go in the evening. I mean, why would you live in the centre of a town if the centre of the town is dead at night? This problem's been faced by big urban centres in the past who've struggled with this for many, many years, and only now are some of the urban centre living flat complexes actually getting some life back into them as the towns develop around them, in a sense.
Just thank you very much, Tony Bramley. Thank you for talking to us. We must stop there. That's all we have time for this time. Please tune in again for more hot topics. In the coming weeks, I'll be talking to Peter Keith, the Labour candidate for Cleethorpes, recently appointed, Cleethorpes and Immingham. Godfrey Bloom, Yorkshire and Humber MEP, no longer from UKIP after references to Bongo Land and women who are sluts. We'll have our regular parliamentary correspondents, Martin Vickers and Austin Mitchell, and I'll be questioning some of the candidates in this spring's local and European elections. Hope you can join me for some of those. For now, goodbye.